Walk out into the hill country between Jerusalem and Hebron in the heat of the afternoon and look down at the ground under your feet. Grey rock, thin dust, a few olive trees leaning in the wind. It looks like nothing, but somewhere in that dirt, according to the book, half the world has built its faith on. 3 men once pitched their tents: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, a grandfather, a father, a son, the founding family of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. More than half the people alive today trace their faith back through that one family of wandering herdsmen. So here is a question that sounds simple and turns out to be anything but. If those 3 men really walked this land, would the land remember them? Go out there with a shovel and dig. Would you find anything at all? A wall, a grave with a name on it, a line of writing scratched into stone that says Abraham was here. Any proof of any kind that they were ever standing where you are standing? For 150 years, that question has started some of the fiercest fights in archaeology. One side was certain the spade would prove the Bible true. The other was just as certain it would prove the whole thing a legend, invented 1,000 years too late. Both sides dug, and both were sure the dirt was on their team. And here is the strange part almost nobody tells you. What came up out of the ground did not settle the fight. It made it stranger. Because the evidence for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is nothing like what either side went looking for. The 3 men who anchored the faith of half the planet left behind, by the honest measure of a shovel, almost nothing at all. And that silence is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a much better one, once you understand what it actually means and what the ground quietly says when you stop demanding that it shout. So we are going to walk the whole case, honestly, the way a detective works a cold case 4,000 years old. What we would expect to find, what people actually found, where the evidence is real, where it has been wildly overclaimed, and where there are details that, if we are honest, should not be there at all. Then a verdict. Not the one either side wanted, but the one the evidence supports. Let's get into it. Let's start with the hardest fact first, because everything else is built on top of it, and pretending it is not there would poison the whole investigation. There is no direct archaeological evidence for Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. None. Not a single inscription anywhere in the ancient world names any of the 3. There is no tomb an archaeologist has opened and confirmed. There is no palace, no monument, no signed document, no coin, no statue. Nothing at all that a scientist can hold up and say, "This object proves this man existed." If you were hoping this video was going to show you Abraham's signature on a clay tablet, I have to be straight with you from the very first minute, the way this channel always tries to be. That tablet does not exist, it has never been found, and most likely it never will be. Now, the moment you hear that, one voice in your head says, well, that settles it then. If there is no evidence, they did not exist. End of story. But slow down, because that reaction, as natural as it feels, is actually a mistake. And it is a mistake because of who these men were, and what kind of life the Bible says they lived. Think about what Genesis actually describes. Abraham is not a king. He does not rule a city. He does not build a temple or raise an army or carve his victories into a wall to impress the neighbors. He is a pastoralist, a tent dweller, a man who moves with the seasons, following grass and water for his flocks, from the hill country down into the dry south and back again, living his whole life in animal hide tents that he folds up and carries on to the next place. Isaac does the same. Jacob does the same. They dig wells. They build the occasional altar out of loose field stones. They bury their dead in a cave, and they move on. That is the entire footprint of their lives. And here is what matters about a life like that. It is designed almost perfectly to leave no trace. Ask any archaeologist what is the single hardest kind of ancient person to find in the ground, and they will tell you it is exactly this: the nomad, the herder, the tent dweller. A city leaves ruins you can dig for a century. A king leaves inscriptions bragging about himself. But a family of shepherds living in tents leaves almost nothing that survives 4,000 years. Tents rot, wooden pegs rot, cloth rots, sheep bones scatter. A campfire washes away in one rainy season. These people did not build in stone, so there is no stone to find. They did not write, so there is nothing to read. They were not important enough in their own lifetimes for any king or scribe anywhere to bother writing their names down. A wandering herdsman in the Middle Bronze Age is, almost by definition, invisible to archaeology. So look at what that does to our question. The absence of a monument for Abraham is not surprising. It is exactly what you would predict, whether he existed or not. If a real Abraham lived the life Genesis describes, he would have left no monument. And if a legendary Abraham was invented later, he would also leave no monument. The silence by itself does not point either way. It cannot convict, and it cannot acquit. Anyone who tells you the missing tomb proves he was made up is making the same size mistake as the person who expected to find his tomb in the first place. They are both looking for the wrong kind of evidence, which means we have to be smarter than that. If you cannot find the man because a nomad leaves no fingerprints, then you stop hunting for the man and you start investigating his world. You ask a completely different question, not can I dig up Abraham, but does the world the story puts him in actually exist? Are the names right for that time and place? Are the customs right? The laws, the prices, the way people made deals and married and buried their dead and named their gods? Because a story can invent a hero, it is much, much harder for a story to invent an entire world, correct in 100 small details from a period its author supposedly knew nothing about. That is the real test, not the man, the world around the man. And it turns out you can run that test. People have been running it and fighting about the results for the better part of a century. So that is where we go next, into the war over the world of the Patriarchs, and it was a genuine war, fought by two armies of brilliant scholars who came to completely opposite conclusions from the same evidence. For most of the 20th century, this fight had two sides, and to understand anything you have read about the Patriarchs and archaeology, you have to know both of them. The first side has a name attached to it, a towering figure in the history of this whole field, an American scholar named William Foxwell Albright. Albright was a giant. For decades in the middle of the last century, he was arguably the most influential biblical archaeologist alive, and he had a mission. He believed the spade would vindicate the Bible. He believed that if you dug carefully and read the ancient texts of the Near East, you would find that the world of Genesis was a real historical world, and that the patriarchs fit inside it perfectly. And for a long time, he and the scholars who followed him seemed to be winning the argument decisively. Here was their case, and I want you to feel how strong it looked, because it was strong. All through the early 20th century, archaeologists were pulling tens of thousands of clay tablets out of the ground across Mesopotamia and Syria. Whole libraries, whole archives of a lost world, from exactly the era the patriarchs were supposed to have lived in, the early part of the second millennium before Christ, what we call the Middle Bronze Age. And when Albright and his students read those tablets, they started finding echoes. The personal names in the tablets sounded like patriarchal names, the way people migrated, the way they herded, the way they made contracts and adopted heirs and handed down blessings. All of it seemed to line up with the world Genesis described. It was as if the background scenery of the Bible was being confirmed, detail by detail, from completely independent sources that no biblical writer could have faked. Albright looked at all of it and concluded, with real confidence, that Abraham was a genuine historical figure of the Middle Bronze Age, and that the patriarchal narratives preserved authentic memories from that time. For a whole generation, that was close to the official story. It was in the textbooks. It was in the study Bibles. If you took a class on this in the 1950s or 60s, you were very likely taught that archaeology had confirmed the world of the patriarchs, that the customs matched, the names matched, and that a reasonable person could hold Genesis in one hand and a stack of Bronze Age tablets in the other and see them shake hands. The case looked, to many, almost closed. But a case that looks closed is exactly the kind that gets blown wide open, and in the 1970s it did, because a second army arrived and they came for everything. In the year 1974, a scholar named Thomas Thompson published a book with a plain, deadly title on the historicity of the patriarchal narratives. And the very next year, in 1975, another scholar, John Van Seters, published his own book on Abraham. And between the two of them, they did something that changed this field permanently. They took the entire Albright synthesis, the whole beautiful structure of matching names and matching customs, and they went through it piece by piece, and they took it apart. Their argument was devastating in its simplicity. They said, look again at all these so-called parallels and ask a harder question. Are they actually specific to the Middle Bronze Age, or do they just sound impressive because nobody checked? And when they checked, the parallels started to dissolve. A custom that Albright's school said matched the time of Abraham perfectly turned out, on closer inspection, to appear across a huge sweep of ancient Near Eastern history in periods 1,000 years apart. A name that sounded like a patriarchal name turned out to be the kind of name people used for many centuries, in many places, not a fingerprint of one era at all. Over and over, Thompson and Van Seters showed that the famous parallels were either vague enough to fit almost any period, or had been quietly stretched to make a match that was not really there. And if the parallels did not actually pin the story to the Middle Bronze Age, then the whole argument that Genesis preserved authentic Bronze Age memory collapsed. The stories, they argued, fit a much later world, the world of the people who actually wrote them down, many centuries after the events they described. That 1-2 punch, those two books a year apart, essentially ended the Albright consensus. It did not just wound it, it knocked it off the throne, and the mainstream of the field swung hard the other way, toward what came to be called minimalism, the view that the patriarchs are literary figures, that Genesis was composed late, and that we should stop treating any of it as history at all until proven otherwise. So which army was right? And this is where I have to slow down, because the honest answer is the one nobody chanting for either team wants to hear. They were both partly right and both partly wrong. Albright overreached. He took real parallels and squeezed more certainty out of them than they could bear, and he wanted the Bible confirmed so badly that he saw sharper matches than were really there. Thompson and Van Seters were right to tear that down, but the minimalist swing overreached in the other direction, treating the total absence of a signed monument as if it were positive proof of late invention, which, as we already saw, it simply is not. The truth sits in the uncomfortable middle, and it can only be found the slow way, by picking up each individual clue and asking of it, honestly, what does this one actually show? Not what do I want it to show? What does it show? So that is what we are going to do for the rest of this investigation. We are going to pick up the clues one at a time, and we are going to start with the one that is strongest, the one that even the skeptics have the hardest time explaining away. The names. Names are stranger evidence than people realize, and to see why, you have to understand something about how names work across time. Think about your own culture. The names people give their children go in and out of fashion in a way that quietly stamps a date on a person. If you meet a woman named Gertrude or Mildred, you are probably not picturing a teenager. If you meet a man named Jaden or Caden, you are probably not picturing an old man. Names have eras. They rise, they crest, they fall out of use. And a name can date a person almost as reliably as a photograph, because no forger 1,000 years later would instinctively know which names were common in a time they never lived in. That is exactly why names are such good evidence. They are the one detail even a careful inventor tends to get wrong, because you cannot fake a naming fashion you have never heard. So here is the test. If the patriarchal stories were invented late, say in the first millennium before Christ, by writers living 600, 800, 1,000 years after the supposed events, then the names in the story should be the names of the writer's own time. They should sound like first millennium names. But if the stories carry a genuine memory from the early second millennium, from the Middle Bronze Age, then the names should be Bronze Age names, the kind that were common back then and had often fallen out of fashion by the time anyone wrote them down. So, which is it? And this is where it gets fascinating, because the answer does not fit the skeptic's story cleanly at all. The patriarchal names are, over and over, authentic names of the early second millennium. They belong to a family of languages and peoples that scholars call the Amorites, a vast West Semitic world of tribes and herders and city-states that spread across Syria and Mesopotamia in exactly the era Genesis puts Abraham in. And the way the patriarchs' names are built, the specific grammatical shape of them, matches the Amorite naming style of that period. These are not random observations. When those tens of thousands of tablets came out of the ground, they were full of people, and the people had names, and again the patriarchal type names show up in the mix, in the right era, in the right region. Take the strongest single example, Jacob. It sounds to our ears like a purely biblical name, a name that belongs to Genesis and nowhere else. But it is not. The name Jacob, in its ancient West Semitic form, is attested as a real name that real people actually carried in the Middle Bronze Age, centuries before the Bible was written down. There is a ruler from the time of the Hyksos, the Semitic people who came to power in northern Egypt in that very period, whose name comes down to us on a whole scatter of scarab seals, little carved seal stones found across Egypt and Canaan, and his name is built from the exact same root as Jacob. Scholars read it as something like, "May the God protect," from the same Semitic root that gives us the name Jacob. Roughly 24 of these seals survive. This is a real man, or at least a real royal name, from precisely the world and the century Genesis assigns to the patriarchs, carrying a version of one of the 3 central patriarchal names. And that same name shows up again, later, as the name of a town in Canaan, recorded in the list a pharaoh carved of the places he claimed to have conquered. Jacob was not a name somebody dreamed up for a holy book. It was a living name of the Bronze Age Near East, on people and on places, exactly where and when the story says it should be. Now I have to add the honest caveat, because a careful investigator always does, and because the skeptics have a fair point buried in here that you deserve to hear. Names alone cannot prove a story. A name being authentically old only tells you that whoever shaped the story either remembered a genuine old name or happened to use a name type that had survived. It does not prove that the specific man Abraham existed, and it does not prove that any specific event happened. Thompson and Van Seters would say correctly that ancient authors could preserve old-sounding names inside stories they largely composed later, the way a modern novelist can set a convincing tale in a century they researched but never lived in. So the names are not a knockout, but do not let anyone wave them away either. Because here is what the names genuinely establish, and it is not nothing. The story is not floating in a made-up world. It is stocked with the real personal names of the real time and place it claims. A late inventor who knew nothing of the Bronze Age would have filled the story with the names of his own day and betrayed himself instantly. These stories did not do that. Whoever built them was working with authentic old material, whatever else they did with it. The furniture in the room is genuinely antique, even if we are still arguing about who built the house, and the furniture goes much deeper than the names. Because the tablets did not just hand us a matching list of names. They handed us a whole matching way of life, the customs, and the customs are where this investigation gets genuinely tangled, because they are, at the same time, the most exciting evidence in the whole case, and the most badly abused. So we have to walk into that room very, very carefully. There is a set of clay tablets that for a while looked like the single best proof that Genesis knew what it was talking about. They come from a place called Nuzi. Nuzi was an ancient town in what is now northern Iraq, and in the 1920s and 30s, archaeologists dug up thousands of clay tablets there, ordinary legal documents from ordinary lives, from roughly the middle of the second millennium before Christ. Marriage contracts, wills, adoption papers, records of who inherited what and who owed what to whom. The everyday paperwork of a whole community frozen in clay. And when biblical scholars in the Albright School read them, they got a jolt, because tucked inside all that dry legal paperwork were customs that seemed to explain some of the strangest moments in the patriarchal stories. Moments that, read on their own, make a modern person frown and think, why on earth did they do it that way? Take the strangest one first. In Genesis, Abraham and Sarah are old and childless, and Sarah does something that sounds shocking to us. She takes her own servant, Hagar, and gives her to her husband, so that the servant can bear a child on Sarah's behalf. It reads like desperation or dysfunction. But in the Nuzi tablets there it is, as a recognized legal arrangement. A marriage contract that actually stipulates that if the wife cannot bear children, she is to provide a servant woman to her husband to produce an heir. Suddenly Sarah is not being bizarre. She is following a known custom of the ancient Near East, spelled out in black and white on a clay tablet from the right part of the world. And it was not just that one. There was the problem of Abraham complaining, before Isaac is born, that with no son of his own, his household servant, a man named Eliezer, is going to end up his heir. Strange, until the Nuzi tablets show childless couples formally adopting a servant or an outsider as a son and heir, on the condition that he care for them in old age and bury them properly, with the arrangement automatically undone if a natural son later arrives. Exactly Abraham's situation. Then there is the eerie scene where Jacob's wife Rachel, fleeing her father Laban, secretly steals his household gods, his little idols, and hides them. And Laban chases them down as if something priceless has been taken. Why would anyone risk that much over a few small figurines? The Nuzi tablets seem to answer it. In that world, possession of the household gods could be tied to inheritance rights, to who was the legitimate heir of the estate. Rachel, on this reading, was not stealing trinkets. She was making a legal grab for her husband's claim on her father's property. And then there is the birthright itself, Esau selling his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew, and the Nuzi world showing us that a birthright was a transferable thing, that one brother really could hand his inheritance rights to another. Do you see how strong this looked? 4 of the oddest, most head-scratching details in the patriarchal stories. the ones a modern reader stumbles over, all suddenly snapping into focus against the background of real, dated, independent legal documents from the ancient Near East. It was not the story explaining itself. It was outside evidence, dug out of the ground in Iraq by people not trying to prove anything about Genesis, quietly making sense of the Bible's weirdest customs. For the Albright school, this was the crown jewel. This, they said, is what authentic ancient memory looks like. The story remembers customs so old that by the time it was written down, nobody would have invented them, because nobody living then even practiced them anymore. And I want to give that argument its full weight, because at its best, it is genuinely strong, and parts of it still stand. But now I have to turn around and show you the other side, because this is exactly the room where honesty matters most, and where a lot of what you will see online about the patriarchs quietly cheats. Because when Thompson and Van Seters and the scholars who came after them went back through these dazzling Nutsi parallels, one at a time, a lot of the shine came off. And their criticism was fair. Take that wife gives her servant custom again. Yes, it appears at Nutsi, but it also appears in law collections from centuries earlier, and in other places, and in later periods too. It was not a narrow fingerprint of one specific age that only an eyewitness could know. It was a widespread practice across a huge stretch of ancient Near Eastern time, which means its presence in Genesis does not pin the story to the Bronze Age at all. A writer many centuries later could have known that custom perfectly well, because it never really went away. The same problem hit parallel after parallel. Some of the Nutsi matches, on a closer and cooler reading, turned out to be looser than they first looked. The biblical scene and the tablet not lining up nearly as tightly as the excited first reports claimed. A couple of them arguably depended on misreading the tablet, or the verse, or both. The household gods and inheritance link, for instance, is now seriously questioned, with many scholars doubting the tablets say what the early enthusiasts claimed. One by one, the crown jewels were pried loose. So where does that leave us, honestly? Not with nothing. That is the mistake the loudest skeptics make, throwing out the whole drawer because some of the jewels were paste. The customs in the patriarchal stories are real ancient Near Eastern customs. The social world of Genesis, the herding, the marriage arrangements, the inheritance disputes, the treaties over wells, the way blessings and birthrights are treated as almost physical things that can be given and grabbed and stolen, all of it is a genuine portrait of the ancient Semitic world. That much is solid, and it is not what you would get from a story spun out of thin air. But the customs cannot do the one job Albright wanted them to do. They cannot date the story to one exact century, because most of them were in use across many centuries. They prove the story is at home in the ancient Near East. They do not prove it is a snapshot of one particular Bronze Age decade, and a good investigator has to hold both of those truths at once without flinching toward either team. But now we have to turn and face the hardest part of this whole investigation, because so far, every clue has either pointed toward authenticity or at worst been neutral. And if I only showed you those, I would be doing exactly what the True Believer channels do, stacking up the hits and hiding the misses. So let me do the opposite. Let me show you, as plainly as I can, the things in these stories that, if we are honest, should not be there. The details that look wrong for the Bronze Age. Because there are some, and they are the single best argument the other side has. Start with the animal that walks through all three patriarchs' lives, the camel. Camels are everywhere in these stories. Abraham has camels. When his servant goes to find a wife for Isaac, he loads up 10 camels, and the woman he finds, Rebekah, is watering camels at the well when he meets her, and she climbs onto a camel to ride back. Jacob has camels. They are woven right through the narrative as ordinary pack animals, the pickup trucks of the patriarchal world, so normal the text never even pauses to explain them. And here is the problem. According to the best archaeological work we have, the camel had not yet been domesticated as a working pack animal in this region during the age the patriarchs are supposed to have lived in. A little over a decade ago, 2 Israeli archaeologists did something clever and careful. They went to the copper mining sites in the dry valley south of the Dead Sea, one of the places you would most expect early camel use if it existed, and they dug up and analyzed the camel bones layer by layer, and they used radiocarbon dating to pin down when camel bones first appear in real numbers. And the answer was strikingly late. The domesticated camel, as a widespread working animal in this part of the world, shows up in the last third of the 10th century before Christ, and not before. That is roughly 1,000 years after the time the Bible assigns to Abraham. In the layers from the patriarchal era, the working camel simply is not there. It arrives on the evidence about a millennium too late to be carrying Rebecca to her wedding. Now, what do you do with that? Because this is a genuine problem, and I am not going to pretend it away. The most straightforward reading is the one many scholars draw, that the camels are an anachronism, a detail from the writer's own later world, when camels were everywhere and unremarkable, accidentally painted back into a much older story, the way a painter might put a wristwatch on a Roman soldier without thinking. And if the camels are a later detail, that is real evidence that the stories, at least in the form we have them, were written down or reshaped centuries after the events, by people to whom camels were so ordinary they never imagined a time without them. That is a fair and serious argument, and an honest investigation has to put it on the table and leave it there. There is a gentler reading too, and I will give it to you without overselling it, because some defenders lean on it too hard. It is possible that camels were known and used occasionally, in small numbers, by some peoples in the wider region earlier than they became common in the mining valleys of the south. There are scattered hints of camels here and there in earlier times, a bone, a figurine, a mention. So it is not impossible that a wealthy herder had a few, but I have to be honest that this is the weaker position. The evidence as it stands points to the working camel arriving late, and the simplest explanation for the herds of camels in Genesis is that the detail comes from a later hand. I would rather tell you that plainly than sell you a comfortable answer that the dirt does not support, and the camel is not alone. There is a second detail like it, and it is just as awkward. The Philistines. In the stories of both Abraham and Isaac, they deal with a king named Abimelech, and the text calls him a king of the Philistines living in the south of Canaan. The trouble is that the Philistines, as an identifiable people in that land, arrive much later than the patriarchal age. They come in as part of a great wave of sea peoples that crashes into the eastern Mediterranean around the year 1200 before Christ, again centuries after Abraham is supposed to have lived. So a Philistine king in the time of Abraham is, on the face of it, like a story about the American frontier that mentions a phone call. Somebody, somewhere, has updated the furniture. And before we get to the half that turns this whole case, one quick thing. If you would rather have the honest, both sides version of a mystery than the flattened one that only tells you what you want to hear, take a second and subscribe, because that is the entire reason this channel exists. Now, back to being honest about the evidence. So let me say the honest thing out loud, because this is the moment the cheaper versions of this story go quiet and hope you did not notice. There are details in the patriarchal narratives that do not fit the Bronze Age. The camels and the Philistines are the clearest, and the most reasonable way to read them is that these stories, whatever old memory they carry, passed through the hands of later people who told them and retold them and wrote them down in a world that had camels and Philistines in it, and some of that later world soaked into the text. That is not me conceding the skeptic's whole case. It is me refusing to hide the part of the evidence that cuts against the grain. Any honest verdict at the end has to account for these, not pretend they are not there. And while we are being honest about overreach, I owe you one more story, a cautionary tale, because it is the perfect example of what happens when people want the evidence to say more than it does. In the 1970s, archaeologists excavating an ancient city called Ebla in Syria uncovered a spectacular archive of tablets, some of the oldest writing of its kind ever found, going back more than 4,000 years. And very quickly, sensational claims began to circulate that the Ebla tablets mentioned the cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, by name, that they contained names like Abraham, that here, at last, was the Bible confirmed in the deepest antiquity. It was in newspapers, it was in books, it electrified people who wanted the patriarchs proven, and it was, almost entirely, wrong. Other scholars who actually specialized in the Ebla texts went back to the tablets and found that the claimed biblical names and cities were mostly misreadings or coincidences or wishful thinking laid over ambiguous signs. The exciting connections were quietly, and then not so quietly, withdrawn. Today the scholarly consensus is that Ebla has essentially nothing to say about Sodom or Abraham or the patriarchs at all. And I tell you that not to embarrass anyone, but because it is the discipline this whole subject demands. The same skepticism I just aimed at the camels, I have to aim at the claims on my own side of the table. Evidence that is too good, that confirms everything too neatly, usually falls apart when the specialists get their hands on it. So we hold the exciting finds to the exact same standard as the awkward ones. That is the only way this is worth anything. So here we are, most of the way through the evidence, and it is genuinely mixed. Real old names, real ancient customs, but not datable to 1 century, and real anachronisms that point to later hands. If I stopped right here, you could walk away thinking it is a wash, a pile of clues that cancel out. But I would be cheating you, because the most interesting evidence in this entire case is the half you have not seen yet. It is not in the names or the customs or the camels at all. It is in something much stranger, something the story does that a forger, a late inventor, building a founding myth, would almost never have done on purpose. Here is the half of the case that changes everything. Ask yourself a simple question about invented stories. When people make up a founding myth, a grand origin tale for their nation or their faith, what do they put in it? They put in the things they are proud of. They make their ancestors heroic. They make their religion look like their own religion, the correct one, the one they practice now. They point everything toward the holy places and the institutions they treasure in their own day. A myth is a mirror people build to flatter themselves. So if the patriarchal stories were invented late by the people of Israel and Judah in the first millennium to give themselves a glorious founding legend, then those stories should be full of the things those later people cared about most. And here is the astonishing part. They are not. Again and again, the stories do the opposite of what an inventor would do. And that, more than any tablet, is the strongest reason serious scholars, even cautious ones, keep concluding that something genuinely old is preserved in here. Start with the religion, because this is the sharpest example. By the time anyone was writing these stories down, the religion of Israel had a very definite shape. There was one God, Yahweh, worshipped in one central place, the temple in Jerusalem, served by one authorized priesthood, the Levites, under one law given through Moses. That was the whole architecture of their faith. It was the thing they were most protective of. the thing their prophets thundered about, the thing that defined them against every neighbor. Now, if you were inventing your founding fathers from scratch in that world, you would make them worship exactly like that. You would have Abraham keeping the law of Moses, honoring Jerusalem, offering sacrifices through proper priests. It would be irresistible. It would make your ancestors the perfect models of your own religion. But that is not even close to what the patriarchal stories show. The religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is strange and old and does not match the later faith at all. There is no temple. There is no Jerusalem as a holy city. There are no Levites, no established priesthood, no law of Moses, because Moses has not been born yet. Instead, the patriarchs worship a God they know by odd, archaic titles: the God of the Father, the fear of Isaac, the mighty one of Jacob, and a cluster of names built on the old word El, God Almighty, God Most High, the everlasting God, the God of Bethel. Scholars have a name for this, the God of the Fathers, a distinctly ancestral, clan-based kind of religion, where God is bound to a family and its head, not to a temple or a nation. The great scholar Albrecht Alt wrote a famous study arguing that this pattern is genuinely archaic, a memory of a religion older than the one Israel later practiced. And it gets more pointed than just different titles. Watch what the patriarchs actually do. They build altars wherever they happen to be, out in the open, under trees, on hilltops, at Shechem, at Bethel, at Hebron, at Beersheba. They worship at a dozen scattered places, freely, with no central sanctuary at all. They plant a sacred tree and call on God there. They set up standing stones. Now here is what should stop you. The later religion of Israel came to condemn almost exactly this behavior. The prophets and the law rail against worship at scattered high places, against sacred trees, against standing stones, and insist that real worship belongs in one place only, Jerusalem. So the patriarchs in these stories are constantly doing the very things the later faith officially frowned on. A late writer inventing model ancestors would never do that. You do not build your founding heroes so that they spend the whole story breaking your own religion's rules. Unless the stories were already old, already fixed in the tradition, too well known and too respected to sanitize, so that the later writers preserved them faithfully, even though the patriarchs' free-roaming, high-place, sacred tree religion no longer matched their own. The awkwardness is the fingerprint. You keep an embarrassing detail because it is true, or at least because it is old, and you are not free to change it. And the pattern goes far beyond the religion. Look at the patriarchs themselves as characters. If you were inventing the glorious founding fathers of your entire people, you would make them admirable. Instead, the Genesis patriarchs are, over and over, a mess. Abraham, twice out of fear, passes his wife off as his sister to save his own skin, letting a foreign king take her. The father of the faith, lying and hiding behind his wife. Isaac does a nearly identical thing. Jacob, whose name the story itself connects to a word for deceiver, cheats his own brother out of his birthright, deceives his blind and dying father with a disguise to steal a blessing, and spends years locked in a war of trickery with his uncle. The founding mothers scheme and quarrel and are torn apart by jealousy. The 12 sons, the fathers of the tribes of Israel, sell one of their own brothers into slavery out of spite and then lie to their father about it for years. This is not a flattering portrait. It is not a myth built to make a people proud of their bloodline. It is a family album full of liars, cowards, cheats and betrayers who somehow are still the ones God chooses. A propagandist inventing a heroic origin does not write his heroes this way. The unflinching, unheroic messiness of the patriarchs reads far more like preserved family memory, warts and all, than like flattering invention. Do you feel how the whole case has quietly turned? The strongest evidence for something real underneath these stories is not a single dramatic artifact. It is this. The stories keep failing to be the myth they would have been if someone simply made them up. They are set in the right ancient world, stocked with the right old names. They carry a religion that does not match and could not have flattered the faith of the people who preserved them. And they hand down a founding family that no one trying to look good would ever have invented. That is not proof of any one event, but it is a strong reason to believe that these narratives are not late fictions spun from nothing. They are old traditions carrying real memory, however much they were retold and reshaped along the way. And there is one more place we can go to feel that reality. One more kind of evidence where the story stops being names and customs and starts being places you could physically stand in today. Because for all that the patriarchs left no monument, they did leave a map. And the map is real. The stories move through specific named places and follow specific sensible routes. And here is what is striking. Those places are real. You can go to them. Beersheba, where Abraham and Isaac dug wells and cut a treaty, is a real, ancient, long-inhabited site in the dry south of the land. Exactly the kind of well country a herder would fight over water in. Shechem, where Abraham first built an altar when he entered the land, and where Jacob later bought a field, is a real city, excavated, occupied across the Bronze Age, sitting in the pass between two mountains, just where the text puts it. Bethel, Hebron, Dothan, where Joseph is thrown into a pit. The whole itinerary hangs together as a coherent journey across a real landscape by someone who knew that landscape. The patriarchs are not wandering through a fantasy geography of invented kingdoms. They move through the actual hill country and desert of Canaan, hitting the actual towns and water sources in an order that makes physical sense on the ground. That does not prove the men, but it anchors the stories to a real and knowable world, not a dreamed one. And there is one place above all where the story reaches out and touches the ground so directly that people still argue over it 4,000 years later. When Sarah dies, Genesis spends an entire chapter, one of the most detailed legal narratives in the whole book, on Abraham buying a burial cave. He negotiates with the local people, the price is named, the field and the cave, and even the trees on it are described, and he buries Sarah there, in a cave at Hebron. And later, the text says, Abraham himself is buried there, and Isaac and Jacob and their wives. A family tomb. And here is the remarkable thing. That site, the cave of the patriarchs at Hebron, has been venerated as their burial place continuously for thousands of years. And over it today stands a massive stone enclosure, its great walls built 2,000 years ago by Herod the Great, the same king who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. It is one of the oldest continuously used sacred buildings on earth. And it stands there for one reason, because the tradition that this is where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lie has never been let go. Now I have to be honest about what that does and does not prove, because it would be so easy to oversell it. The standing building is real and old and genuinely built over the traditional tomb, but no archaeologist has excavated down into the caves beneath it and confirmed whose bones are there, and the identification rests on tradition, on an unbroken chain of belief, not on a dig. So it is not proof that the patriarchs lie beneath it. What it is something quieter and still remarkable. It is a place where a 4,000-year-old story has left a mark you can walk up to and put your hand on, a spot the memory has clung to so fiercely that empire after empire has built and rebuilt over it rather than let the location be forgotten. The tomb does not verify the men, but it shows you how astonishingly durable the memory of them has been anchored to one specific cave, in one specific town, for longer than almost any other memory the human race still keeps. But a tomb is not the closest these men ever come to us. Because there is one more thing to look at, one that reaches nearer to the patriarchs than any grave, and it is the closest thing we have to an actual photograph of the world they lived in. On the wall of an Egyptian tomb, painted nearly 4,000 years ago, right in the patriarchal era, there is a scene. It shows a small caravan of foreigners arriving in Egypt. They are Semitic people from Canaan, about 36 of them, men and women and children, in beautifully colored woven cloaks, bringing their animals and their goods, led by a man the painting labels with a Semitic name and the title ruler of a foreign land. They are exactly the kind of people the patriarchs were. Herders and traders from the land of Canaan moving down into Egypt, just as Abraham does in a time of famine, just as Jacob's whole family eventually does. Nobody claims these painted figures are Abraham or Jacob. But when you look at that wall, you are looking at the real faces, the real clothes, the real donkeys, and the real journey of the very world Genesis describes, painted by Egyptians who watched such people come in the exact century the patriarchs supposedly lived. It is not the patriarchs, but it is their world, caught alive on a wall, and it fits the story like a photograph slid into the right frame. So now we have walked the whole case, the strong and the weak, the hits and the misses, the parts that thrill the believer and the parts that arm the skeptic. And it is time to do the hard thing, the thing the loud voices on both sides refuse to do. It is time to give an honest verdict. Here is what the ground actually says when you stop demanding that it either shout yes or shout no. It does not say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were real individuals whose existence has been proven. It cannot say that. There is no inscription, no tomb, no artifact tied to any of the three, and given the invisible, tent-dwelling, unwritten life the Bible itself describes them living, there almost certainly never will be. Anyone who tells you archaeology has proven the patriarchs is selling you something, usually the same something the Ibla enthusiasts were selling. On that, the skeptics are simply right. The men themselves are beyond the reach of the spade. But the ground does not say they were invented out of nothing either. And this is where the confident skeptics overreach in their turn. Because the world these stories live in is not a fantasy. It is real. The names are authentic names of the right era, including a version of Jacob carried by real people on real seals in the Bronze Age. The customs are real ancient Near Eastern customs. The geography is real geography, walked in a sensible order, and most tellingly of all, the stories are shot through with things no inventor would have put there, a religion that does not match and could not flatter the later faith, and a founding family too full of liars and cowards and cheats to be anyone's flattering myth. Stories spun from pure imagination in a later age do not usually look like this. They flatter. These do not. That refusal to flatter is the strongest tell that real memory is buried in here. And yes, there are the anachronisms, the camels, and the Philistines, and the rest, and we do not hide them. They tell us something true and important, that these stories, whatever ancient core they carry, were told and retold, and finally written down by later people in a later world, and that later world left its fingerprints on the text, painted its own camels and its own neighbors back into the older scene. That is not a scandal. It is just what happens to a memory that travels 1,000 years by mouth before anyone writes it down. It gets carried in the vessels of each age that passes it along. So, the honest verdict, the one most careful scholars have circled back around to after all the wars, is neither of the two things the shouting crowds want. It is not proven history, and it is not late fiction. It is something in between, and frankly more interesting than either. These are old traditions. They carry genuine memory from the world of the second millennium Near East, the world of the Amorite herders and their clan gods and their wells and their wandering. And that memory was preserved and shaped and retold and eventually written down centuries later by people who honored it enough to keep its awkward, unflattering, unupdatable bones intact, even while their own world seeped into its surface. The patriarchs are not a photograph, but they are not a painting of nothing either. They are a memory, a real one, worn smooth and deep by 4,000 years of being carried. And that brings us all the way back to where we started, standing on that hill, holding a shovel, staring at ground that will not give up a single stone with Abraham's name on it. And it turns out the near silence in that dirt was never the embarrassment the skeptics thought it was. It was the point. Think about what actually survives in the ground for an archaeologist to find. Palaces, fortress walls, the war monuments of kings, carved to make sure nobody ever forgets how great they were. The ancient world was full of mighty men who spent their whole lives making certain that the dirt would remember them, piling up stone and bronze and inscription against the day they died. And we dig them up now, those forgotten kings, and we cannot even pronounce most of their names, and no one alive worships their gods or tells their stories or names their children after them. They shouted into the stone, and the stone kept the sound, and the sound means nothing to anyone anymore. And then there are these three herdsmen who built nothing that lasts, carved no monument, left no inscription, and vanished from the dirt so completely that the greatest archaeologists of the last 2 centuries cannot find a trace of them. And yet their names are on the lips of billions of living people. Their story is read every single day, in every country on earth, in 1,000 languages. Half the human race calls them father. They left almost nothing a shovel can find, and they outlasted every king who did. So maybe the real lesson buried in this whole investigation is not about them at all. Maybe it is about what actually endures from a human life and what does not. Because the kings bet everything on the stone, and the stone forgot them. And these three left the stone empty and were remembered anyway in the only place that finally outlasts stone, which is the memory of the living, passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, parent to child, for 4,000 unbroken years. The ground could not keep them, and it did not need to. That is the whole reason this channel exists. To go back to the stories people are sure they already understand, and dig honestly through what is real and what is wished for, until we reach the thing underneath that is stranger and better than either side told you. If this walked you somewhere you did not expect, take a second and subscribe, because there is a thread here we have barely pulled. We kept saying the patriarchs left no monument. But there is one chapter in Genesis that reads completely differently from all the rest. A chapter where Abraham suddenly leaves his tents and his flocks and rides out to war against a coalition of foreign kings whose names read like they were copied straight out of an ancient royal record, and where he meets a mysterious priest-king of a city that would one day become Jerusalem. That one chapter has puzzled scholars for a century, because it does not read like the rest of the patriarchal story at all. It reads like something older and harder, and possibly real in a way the rest is not. The video on that is on screen right now. Go find out why one strange chapter might be the closest the patriarchs ever come to stepping out of memory and into history.